Hello. In this video, I'm going to be presenting two clips of people I greatly admire discussing Brexit and then talking a bit about it myself. The angle I'm taking here is specifically related to the idea that anti-capitalists should support Brexit because of the horrible neoliberal policies of the EU. I strongly disagree with this position, and I'd like to talk about why. But before I get into that, I'd just like to mention that I have a big project in the works right now that I know a decent chunk of my viewers have been anticipating, and that has been taking quite a bit longer than I said it would. The first video in a series of two will be out soon. It's very close to being finished now. I just wanted to reassure people that, it's still coming, don't worry. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. The reason I'm making this video is that I was in the chat for a recent live stream by Jack Saint, and the topic of leftists supporting Brexit came up. I made a reference to the clips I'm showing here, and Jack said he wasn't aware of them. So this one's for you, Jack. The first clip I'm going to show is of English film director and prominent leftist Ken Loach. The clip is from a press panel for his film I, Daniel Blake. The panel was held because the film won the Palme d'Or at the 2016 Cannes Film Festival, the most prestigious award in all of filmmaking. I, Daniel Blake is my second favorite film ever made, and the most recent addition to my top 10 films list. It's about how terrible the situation in Britain has become under the austerity policies of the Tories, a right-wing party that has been in power since 2010, during which time the number of people relying on food banks has increased from tens of thousands to well over 1 million, and the number of homeless people has increased by about a factor of 4. Just a quick note before I play this clip to put it in context. This panel took place in May 2016, shortly before the Brexit referendum happened.
Just picking up on a point you made about Europe earlier, do you think it would be the people who are that lower third in Britain are caught now, they would be better out of Europe? Or do you think if Britain goes its own way in the Brexit vote in June, that kind of neoliberal experiment that's going on in Britain will just get worse?
I think it's a very difficult question because on the one hand, the European Union is a neoliberal project, a drive towards privatization, a drive to deregulation. The safeguards that are there for workers and for the environment are constantly under attack. So it's not doing us any favors at the moment. On the other hand, if we leave, we know the individual governments will be moving to the right as far as possible, again deregulating even further, cutting labour protection for workers, destroying the environment even faster, putting the interests of big business to the fore. I mean, we're faced with a far-right government if we leave. The question is, to me, the question is, how do we fight that best? Do we fight it best from within, where we link up with other European left groups, or do we fight it better from without? It's almost a tactical question. The EU as it stands is a neoliberal project. How do we fight it best, from within or without? I think on balance, we fight it better from within, and we make alliances with other European left movements. But it's a dangerous, dangerous moment.
That whole panel is really good, by the way. I put a link to it in the description, and I'd highly recommend watching it. Shortly after the part that I used in the clip, the screenwriter of the film, Paul Levity, says some really powerful stuff about right-wing propaganda against the welfare system and people on welfare. For example, to demonstrate the impact that said propaganda has had, he brings up a poll conducted on public perception of welfare fraud, in which people were asked what percentage of welfare recipients they thought were fraudulent. The poll came out to be about 30%, when in reality it's only 0.75%. Even if you haven't seen the film, and you should see it because it is one of the most powerful and important films ever made, but even without seeing the film, the panel has a lot of really interesting and worthwhile discussions about poverty, capitalism, and leftist politics. Anyway, now I move to a clip by my favorite stand-up comedian, Stewart Lee. Lee is also a leftist and might be an anarchist. I'm not 100% sure he's an anarchist because he never really clearly states the specifics of his political views, but my guess is based on a few references he makes here and there.
It was second wave anarcho-punk orienteering. We had maps, but all the boundaries were crossed out.
And by his close friendship with vocally anarchist legendary comics writer Alan Moore. Anyway, the following clip is from his most recent stand-up show, Content Provider, in a segment about Brexit. And to give some context, before I play the actual clip I wanted to present, here's how the segment starts.
And then the Brexit vote happened, right? And there seemed to be an assumption everywhere that I should have written some jokes about Brexit. Now, I haven't written any jokes about Brexit because I was trying to write a show that I could keep on the road for 18 months. And as I didn't know how Brexit was going to pan out, I didn't write any jokes about it in case I couldn't use them in the show and monetise the work I've done, right? So I haven't written any jokes about Brexit because I didn't see the point of committing to a course of action for which there's no logical or financial justification.
And now onto the clip itself. Just a quick note, when he uses the term protest vote, he's talking about left-wing people voting to leave the EU as a protest against the neoliberal policies of the EU.
Voting to leave Europe as a protest vote is a bit like shitting your hotel bed as a protest against bad service and then realising you now have to sleep in a shitted bed. And my friend Ian, my best friend, Leave voter, he said to me, "Your metaphor doesn't make sense, Stu," he said. "By your own admission, the EU is institutionally flawed and freedom of movement can lead to exploitation of the labour market. So in a way," he said, "there was already some shit in the bed." And I said, "Yes, Ian, but if there's already some shit in the bed, you don't fix that by doing even more shit into the already shattered bed." And my friend Ian said, "No, you move into a different bed." And I said, "Yes, Ian, but what if that different bed, instead of some shit, has got Boris Johnson in it?" And my friend Ian reluctantly conceded that he would remain in the original shattered bed.
One of my favourite things about Stewart Lee is how he uses humour to make serious left-wing political arguments. As an example of this, I'd point to a segment he did on his show Stewart Lee's Comedy Vehicle, in which he systematically demolished some anti-immigrant garbage spewed by a member of UKIP called Paul Nuttall. I've put a link to an upload of that segment in the description because it is one of the funniest pieces of stand-up I've ever seen, and it is also a very compelling rebuttal of anti-immigrant rhetoric. Anyway, back to the Brexit clips. Both Ken Loach and Stewart Lee make similar points as to why they think leftists should oppose Brexit, but they do come at it from slightly different angles. Ken Loach talks about how Britain will be better able to change the EU from inside the EU, which I completely agree with, and I would add one thing to his point, that being to counter a potential attempt at rebuttal to what he said. Someone might say that Britain needs to look after itself and put itself first, to make sure that the people of Britain's lives improve before worrying about Europe. And to that, I would say that at best this veers dangerously close to nationalism, and at worst outright is nationalism. I mean, essentially what that's saying is Britain first. So yeah, Ken Loach's angle is that Britain can best help change the EU by remaining part of the EU, and the screenwriter of the film, Paul Levity, that I mentioned before, adds another point on top of this, by suggesting that Britain leaving the EU might encourage the far-right elements of other member countries to push them to leaving too, and that this could have very dangerous results.
My fear is, if every country goes alone, it could be a race to the bottom.
Stewart Lee takes a slightly different approach than either Loach or Levity by pointing to the ruling class's motivation behind wanting to leave. And this is important because if you want to know what the result of a political decision is likely to be, it's key to look at why the decision was made in the first place. You need to look at the ruling elite who pushed Brexit. People like scumbag billionaire James Dyson, scumbag billionaire Aaron Banks, scumbag billionaire Jim Ratcliffe, and scumbag politician Boris Johnson, who is a millionaire by the way, and was the example used by Stewart Lee in the routine. If you look at their political ideologies, you'll see their primary motivations for wanting Brexit. Their isolationist right-wing views, their nationalism, and their greed. They want Brexit not because they want to escape the EU's neoliberalism, but due to hunger for personal gain, and due to their dangerous political ideas. Like Lee said, by doing Brexit, the British people are getting into bed with Boris Johnson and his ilk. They aren't going to make Britain a better place, they're going to make it even worse. The people doing the Brexit negotiations don't give a dusty fuck about the workers. Far from it. Now I'd like to talk about how dangerous isolationism is. The rhetoric of Brexiteers is becoming more and more overtly isolationist in nature, and news stories like this are extremely concerning. Some of my viewers will know that while I am undoubtedly and proudly a generalist intellectually speaking, my academic specialization was actually Chinese history. This puts me in a unique position among left-wing YouTubers to talk about how bad isolationism is. During the Ming Dynasty, about 600 years ago, the Chinese Empire's dominant ideology became isolationism. This change was spearheaded by an ultra-conservative, xenophobic faction within the ruling Mandarin class, and the reasons they gave were similar to the propaganda put out by the Brexit crowd during the campaign. After becoming isolationist, China went from being arguably the most powerful empire on the planet to a political backwater within a couple of hundred years, and they became so weak and destabilized that the Manchurians, who had long been regarded as barbarians who posed no real threat, were able to invade China and over the course of several decades systematically conquered the whole empire and founded the Qing dynasty. Under the Qing, China became even weaker, to the point where the Western powers and Japan were able to carve off chunks of the country and govern them. The most famous example of this was Hong Kong being controlled by the British, but Britain got more than just Hong Kong, and France, Germany, and others also controlled other areas of China. The situation got so bad, and so prominent, that the Wikipedia article for territorial concessions uses Qing-era China as an example of the phenomenon in the first paragraph. The reason I am bringing this up is to demonstrate how dangerous isolationism is. It always leads to stagnation, and it is always led by fear and hatred. I can see very clear parallels between Brexit and the Ming shifting towards isolationism during the 15th century, and to be honest, it really worries me. A lot. And before finishing up here, I'd like to talk a bit about the EU itself. While neoliberalism is the surface ideology of the EU, there is another idea involved, which is foundational to the whole concept of the EU, and that's regionalism. Regionalism is the idea that neighbouring countries should cooperate with each other and work together. Neoliberalism could be completely abandoned by the EU. It is not what unites the member countries together. Not really. It's something that the ruling classes in all the member countries agree on, but it could potentially be done away with. And rather than this having a negative impact on the regionalist ideas at the heart of the EU, it would in fact have a positive impact on that. Neoliberalism is far from an ideology of cooperation. It's not what regionalism is about. Regionalism is supposed to be about countries working together to make the world a better place. But it won't happen if major work is not done to make it happen. And like Ken Loach said, Britain is not going to be able to have a hand in that if it leaves. Regionalism is a good idea. Hell, it's a beautiful idea. What needs to be dismantled is capitalism. And while that is more of a long-term goal, scrapping neoliberalism is achievable in the shorter term. But it's going to be an uphill battle. And right now it's downhill that things are going, not uphill. However, you should not let that ever get in the way of the knowledge that change is possible. A better world is possible. A better Europe is possible. Not by nixing the EU, but by fixing the EU. Okay, well I thought that it might be nice to end this video with a happy holidays message. So, Merry Kropotmas everyone. That's all from me for today. Farewell comrades and potential comrades, and I shall see you next time.